The night air clung thick with the smell of salt and oil, the sea crashing against the jagged shoreline as if it too rejected the plan laid out by men who had seen too much war. A team of Navy SEALs crouched low in the shadow of a rocky outcrop, weapons slung tight, eyes narrowed at the objective across the darkened valley. Their mission was simple on paper, suicidal in execution. A heavily armed insurgent compound sat dug into the hillside 3 miles inland, defended by overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire, heavy machine guns, and a reputation for being impenetrable. The intel was grim. Dozens of hostages inside, most of them locals, some American contractors. The order from command was to get them out alive. The SEALs knew their odds were slim. The moonlight etched deep lines across their faces, a mixture of fatigue, frustration, and resignation. Lieutenant Jack Harlan, broad-shouldered, scar down his cheek, spat in the dirt and shook his head. "It can't be done," he muttered, the finality of his words cutting through the tension. The others nodded silently. They weren't cowards, but they knew suicide when they smelled it. A frontal assault? Madness. Sneak in? Impossible with spotlights and motion sensors rimming the compound. Airstrike? No go, civilians were inside. Extraction with 0 losses looked like fantasy. Harlan rubbed the bridge of his nose, weary from the weight of responsibility. Every man here would follow him into hell, but even he couldn't ask them to march into a meat grinder. Major Alexandra Pierce, callsign Iron Hand, walked up the rocky incline with the calmness of someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer and walked away grinning. The SEALs turned, slightly annoyed at the intrusion. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't even Navy. She was Air Force, worse, a pilot. They had heard of her though, whispers in briefing rooms, her name carried with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Some called her reckless. Others called her a savior. She had earned her reputation in Afghanistan, strafing Taliban convoys with pinpoint precision. But here, in this valley of death, even the most decorated pilot seemed useless. "You boys done crying about what can't be done?" she asked, voice steady, each word carrying a razor edge of challenge. The SEALs bristled. Harlan especially. He was used to commanding respect, not being called out. "We're being realistic," he said flatly. "That hill is a fortress and we've got no way in without turning into fireworks. You flying over it won't change the math." Alexandra smirked, the corner of her lips tugging upward. "You've seen a TENS fly before?" she asked. "Sure," Harlan replied. "I've seen them shred tanks at 1,000 feet. But that hill has teeth. Step into the kill zone, and you'll be smoking metal before you fire a shot." No one laughed. The SEALs stared at her, trying to read whether she was insane or if she knew something they didn't. Alexandra took a step closer, crouched beside them, and unrolled a rough sketch map on the dirt. "Here's the deal," she began. "That compound has 3 Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns covering the approach, plus shoulder-fired missiles and small arms. Hit them head-on and yeah, you're toast. But those gunners have a weakness. They expect altitude. They're scanning skyward, not ground level. You give me this valley, I'll come in beneath their radar, skim the dirt, and rip their guns to shreds before they know what's happening." The SEALs exchanged uneasy glances. The idea was insane. But insanity was sometimes the only way out. The map became a battlefield in miniature. Alexandra traced a finger along the valley floor, showing how she could dive in, skid the A-10 between the ridges, unleash a torrent of Gu-8 Avenger fire at the emplacements and clear a path. The SEALs would use the chaos to breach a side gate, slip inside, and extract the hostages while the defenders scrambled under shock. It was wild. It was reckless. And it just might work. Still, disbelief clung to the group like smoke. "You'll never survive the egress," one muttered. Alexandra's eyes hardened. "I'll worry about surviving. You worry about finishing the job." Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was forged in years of training in combat, in late-night sorties where one mistake meant a coffin. She had flown low enough to clip treetops, banked through canyons narrower than a runway, and lived to brag about it. But this would push even her limits. And she relished it. The SEALs still hesitated, until a distant scream of gunfire echoed from the compound, a reminder that the hostages had no time left. Harlan clenched his jaw, looking at the woman who refused to be intimidated. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe she was their only chance. He nodded once, sharp, decisive. "Do it." The walk to her A-10 was silent, save for the crunch of boots on gravel. The SEALs trailed behind, muttering disbelief under their breath. They had seen jets before, but up close in the moonlight, the Warthog looked like something out of a war god's forge, ugly, brutal, armored like a beast too stubborn to die. Its shark mouth pink grinned wickedly, twin engines hunched over the fuselage, wings bristling with ordnance. Alexandra climbed the ladder, strapped in, and powered the beast alive. The engine spun up with a guttural whine, a sound that seemed less machine than predator. Her hands rested on the throttle, steady as stone. Harlan gave one last shake of his head, muttering the phrase that had begun the night, "It can't be done." But deep down, as the A-10 rolled forward and lifted into the air, a sliver of doubt crept into his certainty. Because Alexandra Pierce wasn't like anyone else he had ever met. And sometimes, when the impossible needed doing, it wasn't logic that mattered. It was will, nerve, and the roar of a jet flying lower than fear itself. The night stretched before them, heavy with silence, daring her to prove them wrong. She smiled. The engine screamed as Alexandra pushed the throttle forward, and the A-10 surged down the makeshift dirt strip, its tires hammering against the uneven ground before it leapt skyward like a beast shaking free of its leash. The night swallowed her in seconds, the jet's silhouette melting into the black horizon. Below, the SEALs crouched near their insertion point, helmets tilted back as they watched the improbable takeoff, each man secretly wondering if this would be the last time they saw her alive. The radio crackled in Harlan's ear. "Iron Hand airborne," she said, her voice steady, a calm anchor against the chaos brewing ahead. He almost envied her composure. Almost. Alexandra's eyes scanned the instruments, then the world outside. The valley ahead was a dark throat of stone and shadows, jagged cliffs rising like serrated teeth on either side. No sane pilot would have considered flying into it at night. No sane pilot would have considered flying into it at all. But sanity had nothing to do with survival here. She dipped the nose, bringing the A-10 down lower, the altimeter spinning fast. 50 feet above ground, she muttered to herself, the numbers glowing green on the display. That was her ceiling. Any higher, and the anti-air batteries would track her. Any lower, and the Earth would claim her before the enemy could. Her left hand gripped the throttle, her right resting on the stick, fine muscles twitching with minute adjustments. The A-10 was a beast, not a dancer. It was heavy, armored, meant to lumber and endure punishment. But Alexandra coaxed it with the precision of a maestro, nudging the wings just enough to thread through the valley without clipping stone. The moon flashed against the canopy, and then the valley walls rose higher, narrowing, daring her to continue. "Iron Hand, talk to me," Harlan's voice cut in over comms, taut with nerves. "You still with us?" Alexandra smirked despite herself. "Still here, Lieutenant. And in about 2 minutes you're going to hear thunder." The insurgents didn't know she was coming. That was her only advantage. Their spotters scanned the skies for contrails and shadows overhead, not expecting death to crawl up the valley floor itself. She saw the first glint of metal ahead, the barrel of a Zu-23 emplacement silhouetted against the ridgeline. Her HUD painted it red, and instinct surged in her blood. She rolled slightly, lined up her nose, and pressed the trigger. The Ju-8 Avenger cannon roared, a sound not of this earth, a ripping metallic growl that shook her bones even inside the cockpit. 7 barrels spun, vomiting depleted uranium shells at a rate that turned seconds into eternity. The night lit up with fire. The Zu-23 exploded in a blossom of sparks and shrapnel, its operators never even knowing what killed them. Smoke curled into the air as Alexandra banked left, hugging the valley wall, engines howling. "Target 1 down," she reported coolly. The SEALs, crouched on the ridge overlooking the compound, heard the cannon's roar echo across the valley, felt it in their chests, and exchanged looks of disbelief. None of them had ever heard anything like it. "Holy hell," one whispered. Harlan didn't reply. He simply watched the compound below, where panic was beginning to ripple. Alarms blared in the insurgent stronghold. Men scrambled to their positions, shouting into radios, pointing toward the valley floor where fire had just ripped their first gun apart. But confusion reigned, nothing was visible in the sky. Their searchlights swung wildly, beams cutting across empty air. They were looking up. Alexandra was beneath them. She jinked hard to the right, engine straining, and another gun nest came into view, this one pivoting desperately too late. She squeezed the trigger again. The cannon answered, 30 rounds per second tearing the emplacement apart, bodies flung backward in the storm of fire. A wall of stone beside it fractured, chunks tumbling down in the wake of her wrath. 2 down, Alexandra said, her voice betraying not a hint of the adrenaline flooding her veins. Sweat trickled down her temple, her gloves slick against the stick, but her tone was pure steel. She pulled up just enough to crest the ridge, then dipped immediately, scraping the earth so close that gravel rattled against her fuselage. The third gun roared to life ahead, muzzle flashes spitting into the night. Tracers clawed at the darkness, hot lances of fire snapping past her canopy. Alexandra gritted her teeth, lined up, and pressed the trigger once more. The Avenger spoke, a god of war unleashed at arm's length. The enemy fire vanished, swallowed in a storm of lead and flame. 3 down. Paths clear, she called. For a heartbeat, silence reigned on the comms. Then Harlan's voice came through, ragged but fierce. Copy that. Moving now. The SEALs launched into motion, slipping down the ridge and toward the compound, shadows among shadows. Alexandra banked, circling wide, her eyes scanning for threats. She knew the real fight was about to begin, for the SEALs inside, for the hostages waiting, and for her because egress would be 10 times harder than ingress. But for now the impossible had been done. She had flown the gauntlet and she had lived. Inside the compound the chaos was total. Insurgents shouted, firing wildly into the darkness, some still craning their necks skyward in search of enemies that weren't there. The SEALs used the confusion like a blade, cutting through the outer perimeter with silenced bursts, moving with lethal precision. Harlan led the breach team, his heart hammering not with fear but with awe. That jet was still circling above, growling like a wolf in the dark, daring anyone to stand still long enough to aim. It was more than support. It was a psychological hammer, breaking the enemy's will before a single SEAL set foot inside. Alexandra could hear the gunfire below, faint pops compared to the roar of her engines. She wanted to do more, to rake the compound walls and open the way further, but she had to be careful. Civilians were inside, and one mistake could turn salvation into massacre. She throttled back, circling slow, scanning for reinforcements. A convoy of pickup trucks appeared on her radar, speeding toward the compound from the north. She grinned coldly. Iron hand to ground, got company incoming. I'll handle. She pitched the nose, dove, and unleashed hell again. The first truck erupted in flame, flipping end over end. The others scattered, men diving out as the cannons stitched the dirt beside them. None reached the compound. The SEALs pushed deeper, clearing room after room, shouts of frightened hostages mixing with the rattle of suppressed gunfire. Harlan's team secured the central hall, herding the captives together. Some cried, some clutched one another, all stared at the strange Americans who had appeared like ghosts in the smoke. We're here to get you out, Harlan said, his voice clipped but firm. They would need to move fast. Already, resistance was stiffening as the insurgents realized the scale of their disaster. The battle was far from over. Above, Alexandra rolled her jet into another pass, engines screaming defiance into the night. She knew her fuel was burning fast, her margin for error shrinking by the second. She also knew she would not leave until every hostage was clear. She had promised without ever saying the words. The SEALs had doubted her. Harlan had sworn it couldn't be done. Yet here she was, carving fire through the dark sky, proving that sometimes the impossible was only impossible until someone dared to do it. The compound seethed with chaos. Alarms shrieked, dogs barked madly from their chains, and the scattered shouts of insurgents cut through the smoke as gunfire echoed from every direction. The SEALs moved like shadows in the din, each man sliding from cover to cover with fluid precision, their suppressed rifles coughing death in short bursts. They were ghosts in black, invisible until it was too late. At the center of it all, Harlan pressed forward, his pulse hammering but his focus unbreakable. He counted 17 hostages so far, some too weak to walk, others terrified but clutching at freedom as if afraid it would vanish. Secure them, move to Rally Point Bravo, he ordered, voice clipped through his headset. His men obeyed without hesitation. Above them, Alexandra circled, her A-10 carving arcs across the night sky. She listened to their comms, every word like a lifeline tying her to the men below. She wanted to stay close, to drop into the compound and wipe it clean with fire, but she couldn't risk it. The Gu-8 was thunder incarnate, and even a half-second burst would reduce walls to rubble and people to ash. The hostages were too close. Her role now was protection from without, eyes sharp for reinforcements, claws ready to strike at anything that moved within a mile of that valley. Her radar pinged again, another column of trucks, bigger this time, heavier weapons mounted on their beds. She bared her teeth in the cockpit, whispering to herself, "Come on then." The trucks came fast, headlights off, trying to mask their approach. But the moon betrayed them, glinting faintly on windshields and metal. Alexandra rolled into a dive, her engines howling. She was in her element now. The first truck exploded under a burst of cannon fire, fragments cartwheeling into the air. The second tried to swerve, brakes squealing on dirt, but the Avenger caught it mid-turn, splitting it in half with a torrent of shells. The rest scattered like leaves before a storm. Survivors scrambled into ditches, firing rifles blindly at the night sky, but Alexandra was already gone, banking hard to set up another run. Her voice was calm when she radioed down, "Convoy neutralized. You've got a window, don't waste it." Inside the compound, Harlan's team met heavier resistance. Gunfire hammered from the east wing, bullets punching holes into plaster and spraying dust into the halls. The SEALs moved fast, but the insurgents were desperate now, and desperation could be dangerous. Harlan ducked behind a wall as a burst chewed through the doorframe inches from his head. "Two on the balcony," he muttered. His teammate, Ramirez, popped up, sighted, and dropped both with 2 clean shots. The hall was theirs. Still, every second mattered. The longer they stayed, the more enemies regrouped, and the closer reinforcements came. "Status?" Alexander's voice crackled in his ear. "We've got the hostages," Harlan replied, panting as he scanned the corridor. "Still clearing resistance. 10 minutes, maybe less." "You don't have 10 minutes, Alexandra shot back. "You've got 5. Another convoy's mustering on the far ridge. Heavier trucks. Looks like they brought an anti-air gun on wheels this time." Harlan swore under his breath. "Copy. We'll move faster." The SEALs herded the hostages toward the breach point, where a section of wall had been blown open during Alexandra's first pass. The civilians stumbled, wide-eyed, clinging to the operators who half-dragged them forward. Women whispered prayers. Men clenched their teeth. A child sobbed softly into a soldier's chest as he was carried. Harlan covered the rear, firing short bursts to keep the enemy at bay. He didn't look back at the faces behind him. He couldn't afford to. Every second, every step was another gamble. Alexandra flew low over the compound, engines rattling the roofs, sending insurgents diving for cover. She didn't fire, not yet, but her presence was a blade pressed against their throats. To the hostages, the roar was terrifying. To the SEALs, it was a promise. She was still there. She wasn't leaving. Then the warning light on her console blinked red. Radar lock. Her stomach clenched. Somewhere in the chaos, a shoulder-fired missile had just locked onto her heat signature. Missile launch, she barked into the radio, jerking the stick. The A-10 groaned under the violent maneuver as she banked hard, flares spitting from the wings in a blinding spray. A streak of fire shot up from the compound, curving toward her tail. The flare caught it at the last second, exploding harmlessly in the air behind her. The cockpit shook with the blast. Alexandra gritted her teeth, her hands tight on the controls. "They're desperate," she said through the comms. "Get those people out now." Harlan heard the panic in the hostages, the whispers as they saw the missile trail vanish into fire above. He shouted to his men, urging speed. They reached the breach, shoved the civilians through, and spilled into the night air. The valley stretched ahead, a path to salvation and death both. The SEALs spread out, forming a perimeter as they began the long retreat to Extraction Point Bravo. Gunfire followed them, flashes of light from the compound roof. But Alexandra was there, diving again, unleashing short bursts at the muzzle flashes, forcing the shooters to scatter. She wasn't just flying support, she was carving a shield out of the night sky itself. The ground shook with another explosion. This one wasn't hers. The second convoy had arrived, mortars lobbing shells from the ridge. Dirt plumed into the air ahead of the SEALs, showering them with stone. Hostages screamed, dropping to the ground. Harlan cursed, shoving them forward. "Move. Keep moving." The path was narrowing, fire hemming them in. He looked up, desperate. "Iron Hand, we're pinned." "I see it," Alexandra replied. Her eyes locked on the ridge. The trucks were spread out, one carrying the telltale silhouette of a mounted anti-air system. Her gut tightened. If she went after them, she'd be fully exposed, no cover, no chance to evade. But if she didn't, the SEALs would never make it out alive. She thought of Harlan's voice, low and certain. "It can't be done." She thought of the faces below, huddled together in terror. She thought of the oath she had made, not in words but in blood and steel. And then she pushed the throttle forward. The A-10 screamed across the valley, a predator unchained. The ridge rose ahead, dotted with muzzle flashes and frantic figures scrambling for cover. The mounted gun pivoted, trying to track her. She didn't give it the chance. She pressed the trigger and the Avenger thundered, louder than the world itself, spitting death in a stream of fire. The truck disintegrated under the barrage, flipping end over end. Men scattered, some vanishing into smoke, others crumpling under the rain of rounds. She didn't stop. She raked the line of vehicles, one after another, until the ridge was nothing but flame and wreckage. "Clear," she said into the comms, breathless for the first time that night. Below, the SEALs surged forward, driving the hostages toward the extraction zone. Harlan risked a glance up at the sky, where the A-10 banked against the moonlight, wings scarred with soot and dust. He shook his head in disbelief. "Damn you, Pierce," he muttered, half in awe, half in fear. "You're going to get us all killed. Or save us." The night burned with smoke and fire as the SEALs drove the hostages onward, their boots pounding the dirt trail that wound through the valley floor. Every step felt stolen, bought by Alexandra's thunder from above. The men carried civilians on their backs, dragged the weak by their arms, shoved the able-bodied forward with sharp commands. Gunfire still barked behind them, distant now but persistent. The compound hadn't given up the chase. Harlan glanced over his shoulder, sweat running into his eyes, and saw dark figures spilling from the broken walls like ants from a ruined nest. "Keep moving," he barked, forcing the column forward. Ahead, the path opened toward the extraction zone, a wide clearing where helicopters would descend once they gave the signal. It should have been salvation. Instead, dread twisted in his gut. Alexandra circled high, her eyes narrowing as her radar pinged again. The ridge beyond the clearing flashed with new signals, heat blooms from engines too many to be coincidence. She zoomed her optics and the picture snapped into cruel focus. Technicals. Dozens of them, engines idling low, weapons bristling. Trap. The insurgents had anticipated the escape route, setting up their own ambush. Her blood ran cold. She toggled the comms. "Ground team, be advised, your extraction zone is compromised." "Repeat, compromised." Harlan froze for a heartbeat, his stomach plummeting. "Define compromised." "You've got at least 15 trucks on the ridge line with heavy weapons, maybe more. They're waiting for you to walk straight into the kill box." Silence stretched for a second, broken only by the ragged breathing of hostages and the faint crackle of the comms. Then Harlan's voice came back, low and grim. "Options. You don't want the ones I'm thinking of," Alexandra said. She banked hard, engine straining. "But I'm going to give them to you anyway." Her mind raced. She had only minutes of fuel left in her main tanks, and she'd burned through half her ordnance already. She could level part of the ridge but not all of it, not without risking a counterstrike that would tear her apart. Yet if she did nothing, the SEALs and their civilians would walk straight into slaughter. She tightened her grip on the stick, forcing her thoughts into clarity. The Warthog wasn't built for finesse. It was built for ugly, close-range brutality. And that was exactly what this situation demanded. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice iron, "I'm going to draw their fire. You take your people low through the ravine to the east. It'll be tighter, slower, but it'll get you around the ridge." "That ravine's a choke point," Harlan shot back. "If they pin us there, we're done." "Then don't get pinned," Alexandra replied sharply. "I'll make sure of it." Without waiting for argument, she rolled her A-10 into a steep dive. The engines roared like beasts unleashed, the ground rushing up as the ridge line snapped into view. The insurgents panicked, their trucks jerking forward, muzzles swiveling skyward. Tracers lanced the night, clawing at her from every angle. Alexandra grit her teeth, flares spitting bright behind her as she leveled the nose. "Time to dance," she whispered. Her fingers squeezed the trigger, and the Gu-8 Avenger bellowed again, shaking the heavens. Shells ripped through the first line of trucks, detonating fuel tanks, shredding men and steel alike. The ridge erupted into chaos. "Move. Now." Harlan bellowed. His team surged east, dragging the hostages into the ravine. The path was narrow, walled by jagged stone, the ground uneven. But it shielded them from direct fire. The hostages stumbled and cried, but the SEALs drove them forward, relentless. Above, Alexandra took the brunt of the storm. Anti-aircraft fire stitched across the sky, bullets rattling against her armor plating, each impact a hammer blow. Warning lights blazed on her console, but she forced the jet into another pass. "Not yet," she muttered, sweat soaking her flight suit. "Not until they're clear." Her second run was uglier. Tracers tore past her canopy, one grazing the wing with a flash of sparks. The jet shuddered, alarms blaring, but she held steady. She raked another cluster of trucks, sending bodies tumbling and steel splitting apart. Explosions lit the ridge, painting the valley in hellish light. The insurgents were screaming now, firing wildly into the night, some breaking and running as their ambush collapsed. Alexandra pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing her into the seat. Her breath came ragged, but her eyes flicked immediately to the ravine. She saw them, shadows moving, alive, pressing deeper into cover. Relief was brief, fleeting. "Ravine clear so far," Harlan's voice reported, harsh with effort. Hostages moving, team intact. But we're boxed in. If they circle around? I'll keep them busy, Alexandra interrupted. She scanned the ridge. Not all the trucks were destroyed. A few had peeled off, swinging wide, engines growling as they tried to flank the ravine. She cursed under her breath. She didn't have the fuel for endless passes nor the ammo. Each burst from the Avenger 8 precious seconds of survival. And yet she couldn't stop. She angled the jet again, ignoring the alarms screaming in her ears. The flankers never made it. Alexandra swooped low, releasing a pair of Hydra rockets that streaked into the lead trucks. Fire blossomed across the hillside, debris tumbling into the ravine entrance. For a moment, the path behind the SEALs was sealed by flame. She exhaled sharply, tension bleeding from her shoulders. Iron hand to ground, path's clear for now. Keep pushing. Harlan didn't waste words. Copy. Moving. The ravine stretched on, twisting and narrowing, every bend another choke point. The SEALs hustled the hostages forward, their breaths ragged, their muscles burning. One collapsed, too weak to continue, and Ramirez slung him over his shoulders without slowing. Harlan brought up the rear, firing occasional bursts to keep shadows at bay. The enemy was still there, still following, though disorganized by Alexandra's onslaught. It was a race now, speed against survival. Alexandra checked her gauges. Fuel low. Ammo lower. She had maybe 1-2 more heavy passes left before she'd be a target without teeth. She glanced east, where the ravine opened toward the secondary extraction zone, an open field by a dried riverbed. If the helicopters were on time, salvation waited there. If not, they'd all be trapped in the kill zone with no cover and nowhere to run. Her jaw tightened. She toggled her calm. Harlan. I'll cover your exit, but I'm almost dry. You're going to have to finish this on foot. Harlan's reply was grim but steady. Understood. Just get us to that field. The SEALs pressed through the final stretch of the ravine. Gunfire barked behind them, but Alexandra swooped one last time, her cannon thundering across the valley floor, forcing the pursuers to scatter. The ravine walls shook with the impact, stones tumbling, dust choking the air. The SEALs emerged coughing, dragging the hostages into the open. The field stretched before them, pale under the moonlight, wide and exposed. And empty. No helicopters. No salvation. Just silence. Alexandra circled overhead, her heart sinking. Extraction birds are late, she reported, her voice raw. You're on your own until they get here. Below, Harlan looked out over the barren field, jaw clenched. Behind him, the hostages huddled, exhausted, terrified. His men formed a tight perimeter, rifles ready, eyes scanning the darkness. He knew what was coming. The insurgents weren't done. The ridge behind them still burned, but sooner or later, survivors would regroup, and when they did, they'd sweep this field like locusts. Harlan raised his rifle, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. He keyed his mic, iron hand will hold. You keep the sky burning. Alexandra banked the jet, her eyes on the horizon. Her fuel was bleeding away. Her ammo count was almost zero. And yet, as the enemy began to regroup on the ridges, shadows gathering for a final assault, she smiled through the sweat and the alarms. Because if this was the end, then she would make it roar. The firefight inside the compound raged like a storm without end, bullets sparking off walls and ricocheting down corridors as the SEALs carved their way toward the hostages. The chaos Alexandra had unleashed outside had worked, but only partially. Many defenders were still in place, dug into hardened positions, and they fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Lieutenant Harlan led from the front, his rifle spitting precise bursts that dropped enemies before they could line up a shot. His men moved like shadows, practiced, lethal, but for every gunman they silenced, 2 more seemed to emerge from stairwells or side rooms. The compound was a labyrinth, and every turn was another risk of being flanked. The hostages had been located in the central chamber, a crude holding area with barred doors and chain-link partitions. The men and women inside were terrified, some beaten, others slumped with exhaustion. When the SEALs burst through, weapons raised, their fear turned to stunned relief. Harlan ordered the breach team forward. Cut it open. We're moving now. Bolt cutters bit through chain links, the sound of metal snapping echoing louder than gunfire in that tense moment. The hostages poured out, some stumbling, others too weak to walk without assistance. Medics distributed quick stim packs and carried the worst of them. The clock was ticking, every second inside this place tightening the noose around their necks. Above them, Alexandra still circled, her A-10 flying lower and tighter than the manual ever intended. She had already chewed through half her ordnance, obliterating emplacements and scattering defenders, but she knew the fight below wasn't won yet. Her headset crackled. Eagle 1, we've got the hostages moving to exfil. Relief touched her chest for only a moment before another voice cut in, urgent, panicked. Multiple hostiles regrouping at the north side. Trucks with mounted guns, heavy caliber, closing fast. Alexandra's eyes narrowed. She banked hard, rolling the Warthog on its side to scan the ridge. There they were, a convoy of technicals roaring through the dirt, headlights cutting jagged beams through the night, heavy weapons bristling. If they reached the compound before the SEALs could pull out, it would be a slaughter. Her fingers slid to the trigger. The Gu-8 thundered again, shells raining down like divine punishment. The lead truck exploded in a fireball, flipping onto its side. Another tore open, spilling its gunners in a spray of debris. Yet more vehicles swerved, skidding out of formation, but they kept coming. She couldn't get them all in one pass. Alexandra cursed under her breath and swung wide, lining up again, pushing the A-10 so low she could see the individual faces of the insurgents as they screamed up at her. She squeezed, and again the Avenger spoke, shredding steel and bone alike. The night burned with fire, but the convoy wasn't entirely stopped. A few vehicles kept rolling, stubborn, spitting heavy fire up at her. Rounds clanged against her armor plating. One hit rocked the jet hard enough that alarms shrieked in her cockpit. She fought the stick, gritting her teeth. Not yet, she growled. Meanwhile, the SEALs had begun their withdrawal, hostages in tow, ducking through the smoke-filled hallways. Explosions outside rattled the walls, each detonation a reminder that Alexandra was still out there, keeping the wolves at bay. The men moved fast, covering each other, but the weight of injured slowed them down. Harlan barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Move, move, move. Keep low. They burst out of the side gate into the open night. The valley stretched ahead, the extraction zone somewhere beyond the ridge. But freedom lay across open ground now crawling with defenders regrouping after the initial shock. Bullets ripped the dirt at their feet as muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Alexandra spotted it instantly. Her eyes scanned the SEALs sprinting across open terrain, hostages stumbling, fire chasing them from all sides. She had to shield them. No hesitation. She dropped altitude again, the A-10 screaming down like a hawk protecting its young. Her gun barked, drawing lines of death across enemy firing lines. Men scattered, gunners cut down, positions torn apart. The earth itself seemed to convulse under her assault. The SEALs dove forward, seizing the opening she created. Hostages were dragged and carried, desperation lending strength to tired arms. But not all threats could be swept away. One last Z-23, hidden and waiting, suddenly lit the sky with a burst of flaming tracers. It had survived her earlier runs, concealed under camouflage, and now it roared to life with vengeance. The round streaked upward, striking dangerously close, one ripping across her wing. Warnings screamed in her cockpit, lights flashing red. For a heartbeat, her vision blurred with the force of impact, and the A-10 staggered like a wounded beast. Yet still, Alexandra held her grip. She twisted, rolled, and dove straight at the emplacement. If they wanted to take her down, she'd make them pay the price. The gun thundered. Her rounds tore into the Zu-23, obliterating it in a hail of sparks and fire. But not before one last shell clipped her fuselage. Smoke trailed behind her as she pulled up, alarms still shrieking. Iron Hand, talk to me. Harlan's voice crackled over the comm. She forced her voice calm, steady, even as sweat beaded her brow. Still flying. Keep moving. Don't stop. Below, the SEALs kept running, every step carrying them closer to the ridge line, closer to survival. The hostages stumbled but pushed forward, driven by sheer instinct to live. As the team neared the extraction zone, flares lit up in the distance. Helicopters thundered in, rotors chopping the night, their side gunners laying down suppressing fire. The valley became a battlefield of light and sound, tracer rounds stitching the sky, explosions pounding the earth. The SEALs pushed the hostages aboard, covering every angle. Harlan was the last, scanning the dark, ensuring no one was left behind. Above, Alexandra circled still, smoke trailing, the Warthog refusing to die as long as her hands were on the controls. When the last helicopter lifted, dust whipping across the ground, Alexandra made one final pass, strafing the last group of pursuers who dared chase the retreating birds. Her jet roared like thunder, her rounds blazing one last path of destruction. Then, with fuel low, systems damaged, and her mission complete, she pulled up toward the stars. The valley behind her burned, but the hostages were free, the SEALs alive. Inside the helicopter, hostages clung to their rescuers, tears streaking dirt-stained faces. The SEALs sat slumped, drained, weapons across their laps but alive. Harlan looked out the side door, catching a glimpse of the A-10 wheeling through the night sky, smoke trailing but wings still steady. His voice was low, almost reverent. Damn. She actually did it. For the first time in his career, the words he had sworn earlier rang hollow, replaced by something new. Belief. Alexander's voice crackled through the comms, tired but steady. All units clear. Hostages secured. You boys still think it can't be done? There was silence, then laughter, raw and incredulous, filling the cabin. They had doubted her, dismissed her plan as madness. But madness had saved them. Madness, and the unshakable will of a pilot who refused to accept the word impossible. The night was far from over, her jet needed nursing, the enemy wasn't fully destroyed and the long war stretched on. But in this moment, victory belonged to them. And to the woman who had thundered through hell itself to prove them all wrong. The sun had begun its slow descent over the jagged ridges, casting the valley in a bruised gold light that turned every shadow into a looming specter. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, cordite, and earth scorched by fury. The battle had been won, or at least the first act of it. The hostages were free, the compound lay in ruins, and the SEALs, bruised and bloodied, carried the weight of something that could only be described as disbelief. Alexandra Pierce, callsign Iron Hand, had done the impossible. She had skimmed her A-10 Thunderbolt 2 mere feet above the ground, shredding anti-aircraft positions and opening a path that logic had insisted could never exist. But victory was never clean. Not here. Not in a war zone where enemies bled into shadows and vengeance was a currency no one stopped trading. As the SEALs regrouped at the extraction point, a mile from the compound, Harlan could not shake the feeling gnawing at the back of his skull. It was too easy. Yes, they had fought hard, and yes, they had bled, but the enemy had retreated faster than expected. That kind of retreat wasn't surrender, it was strategy. We've got a problem, Harlan muttered, scanning the jagged peaks with binoculars. Sweat ran down his scarred cheek despite the cooling dusk. The hills were alive with whispers of movement, silhouettes shifting along the ridge lines. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. Alexander's voice crackled over comms from the cockpit above, circling like a hawk. You see it too, don't you, Lieutenant? She asked. Harlan grunted in reply. Yeah. They're repositioning. Licking their wounds and planning something ugly. The truth revealed itself moments later. A convoy of armored trucks and technicals roared from the far side of the valley, their engines bellowing like beasts. Mounted heavy guns caught the last rays of sunlight, flashing metal teeth. They weren't running. They were regrouping to crush the SEALs and reclaim the hostages. Contact North Ridge, shouted one of the SEALs, dropping behind a boulder as bullets ricocheted like angry sparks. The team moved with the sharp precision of muscle memory, returning fire, spreading out, shielding the civilians caught in the chaos. Hostages screamed, ducking as gunfire cracked the air into shards of terror. From above, Alexandra banked her A-10 hard, the beast rolling into a predatory dive. Her HUD lit up with targets, more than she liked, and spread wider than her fuel and ammo would comfortably allow. She muttered to herself, steady hands guiding the stick. All right, you sons of bitches, let's dance. The Ju-8 Avenger thundered again, each shell tearing the earth like the fist of an angry god. Trucks exploded, shrapnel spun through the air, and men scattered in blind panic. Yet even in the chaos the insurgents pressed forward. For every truck destroyed, another seemed to emerge from the hills. Too many, Harlan muttered through gritted teeth as he fired controlled bursts from his rifle. They're trying to box us in. Not if I keep cutting holes in their box, Alexandra replied sharply, yanking the A-10 into another strafing run so low that dust and rock sprayed upward in her wake. Bullets peppered her armor, the titanium bathtub shielding her cockpit ringing with the metallic clang of near death. The plane shook, but she didn't flinch. Her focus was absolute. But the insurgents weren't fools. They had learned. A surface-to-air missile streaked skyward, smoke trail cutting across the twilight. Missile launch. Break, 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 came the frantic call. Alexandra's instincts took over, stick yanked, throttle shoved, chaff flared. The A-10 roared upward at a gut-churning angle, the missile whipping past by mere yards before detonating in a blossom of fire. The shockwave rattled her teeth, but the hog kept flying, stubborn as its pilot. Jesus Christ, Harlan muttered, watching the near miss. She's gonna get herself killed. Better me than all of you, Alexandra replied, voice grim but steady, cutting through the comms like steel. On the ground, the firefight became a blur of survival. The SEALs laid down suppressing fire, guiding the hostages behind cover, dragging the wounded when necessary. Every second felt like an hour, every inch of ground fought with sweat and blood. And yet, above them, the sound of the A-10's engines became a rhythm of hope. Each dive a promise, each strafing run a reminder that they were not alone. But hope had limits. Fuel gauges dipped. Ammunition counts dwindled. Alexandra's voice came through the radio, quieter, controlled. 2 more runs before I'm Winchester. After that, you're on your own until reinforcements get here. The words hit the SEALs like a punch. Reinforcements were still hours out. They had to hold until then. Harlan cursed under his breath, then barked orders with the precision of a man who refused to die here. Form a line, keep them back, buy her the time she needs. Nobody falls today. Not us. Not the civilians. The final 2 passes were a masterclass in controlled rage. Alexandra skimmed so low she could see the whites of enemy eyes before they scattered under her fire. Trucks erupted, men dove for cover, the very earth seemed to shake with the fury of her Avenger cannon. On her last pass, she took out a technical just as it aimed its heavy gun at the SEALs, saving half the team from certain death. She pulled up, ammo dry, fuel screaming for mercy. I'm out, she announced, voice heavy. You're gonna have to dig in and pray I scared them enough to give you breathing room. For a moment, silence. Then the ridge fell quiet. The enemy, battered and broken, began to retreat, not out of mercy but survival. Alexandra had carved so much chaos into their ranks that their will to fight cracked. They melted back into the hills, their convoy reduced to smoldering wrecks. The SEALs didn't cheer. Soldiers rarely did. They just breathed. Exhaustion crashed into them, but relief was stronger. Harlan exhaled, looking up at the circling hog, battered and smoking but still airborne. You proved me wrong again, Pierce, he muttered. Guess it can be done. From the cockpit, Alexandra leaned back against the seat, sweat dripping down her temples, adrenaline finally ebbing. Her lips tugged into a tired but triumphant smile. She had danced with death, flirted with the impossible, and walked away. Again. But deep inside she knew this wasn't the end. The enemy would return. And when they did, she'd be waiting, low and loud, with the thunder only an A-10 could bring. The valley was quiet now, but it was the kind of silence that never soothed. Smoke curled into the sky from burning wrecks, drifting upward like the ghosts of the men who had fallen. The ground was littered with shell casings, shattered weapons, and the blackened husks of trucks torn apart by cannon fire. Every breath tasted of dust and cordite. The SEALs sat in a loose perimeter around the rescued hostages, their weapons still raised, their eyes still restless. No one trusted the silence. Even the civilians seemed frozen in it, huddled close, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. They had been prisoners for weeks, beaten, starved, and humiliated. Now they were free, but the look in their eyes said freedom was still a foreign thing. Harlan crouched near the edge of the perimeter, binoculars in hand. He scanned the hills again and again, but the insurgents had vanished like smoke in wind. He didn't like it. They weren't the type to break so easily. Retreat was survival, not surrender. They'll be back, he muttered, lowering the glass. A shadow passed over him, followed by the familiar rumble of turbofans. Alexandra's A-10 circled above, smoke trailing faintly from one wing. She was low on fuel, her ammo gone, her hog wounded but alive. Her voice crackled over comms, rough and weary. Extraction birds inbound. 10 minutes out. You boys and girls better be ready to move. Copy that, Harlan replied. His voice carried a steadiness his gut didn't feel. 10 minutes was a lifetime out here. We'll hold. He glanced back at the civilians. A little girl no older than 7 clung to her mother, her eyes locked skyward on the circling A-10. Harlan followed her gaze. There was something about the way she looked at the plane, like it wasn't just a machine but a guardian angel. For her, Alexandra Pierce wasn't just a pilot, she was salvation, thunder with wings. Minutes dragged like hours. The extraction bird finally roared into the valley, rotors chopping the air, kicking up a storm of dust as it descended. The SEALs moved quickly, hustling the civilians toward it. Some stumbled, too weak to walk. The operators carried them without hesitation. It was organized chaos, the kind forged from years of muscle memory and shared hardship. Harlan was the last in line, his rifle sweeping the ridge one final time. He felt it before he saw it. Movement, a ripple of darkness against the rocks. Then came the crack of a rifle. A bullet hissed past his ear, close enough to sting. Contact, he shouted, diving behind a rock. Gunfire erupted again from the hills. The insurgents hadn't given up, they were trying one last time to bleed them before they escaped. The SEALs dropped, returning fire, their bodies forming a living shield between the hostages and the incoming storm. The helicopter shuddered as rounds pinged against its armor. The pilot cursed over comms, "We're taking fire, we gotta lift in 2 minutes." From above, Alexandra heard it all. She looked down at her fuel gauge at the empty ammo counter. She was flying a blunt, wounded giant with nothing left to bite. For a second, frustration flared like fire in her chest. She wasn't used to being helpless. She wasn't used to watching her team bleed without being able to strike back. But helpless wasn't in her vocabulary. She adjusted her comms. Harlan marked the ridge line. "I've got a trick left in me." Harlan didn't ask what kind. He trusted her now as much as any man could trust someone he'd once doubted. He popped smoke, purple billowing upward, curling against the twilight. Marked. Alexandra rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, not to fire but to frighten. She pushed the engines hard, bringing the hog down so low the insurgents could see the battered snout and hear the guttural thunder of its turbines. Dust and debris blasted outward as she skimmed the ridge, so close the ground seemed to scrape her belly. The insurgents broke under the pressure, scattering back into the rocks. Some fired wildly but most ducked, unwilling to test their luck against the demon bird that had already chewed through their ranks earlier. It wasn't bullets this time, it was fear. Fear was a weapon too, and Alexandra wielded it with brutal precision. "Move. Move. Get those civilians on board." Harlan shouted, his voice hoarse. The SEALs pushed the last of the hostages into the helicopter, then piled in themselves. He was the last again, sprinting through the dust storm, leaping onto the ramp as it lifted. Gunfire still snapped from the hills, but it grew faint as the helicopter clawed skyward. Inside, the rescued civilians clung to their rescuers, tears streaming freely now that survival was certain. The SEALs sat in silence, weapons across their laps, eyes scanning even as exhaustion tugged at them. Harlan leaned against the wall, sweat-soaked and bone-tired. He looked out at the A-10 circling above them, smoke trailing, limping its way toward friendly skies. "She stayed with us the whole damn time," one of the younger SEALs said softly, almost to himself. There was awe in his voice. "Yeah," Harlan replied. His voice was low but there was something new in it, respect, the kind earned in fire. "She did." By the time they reached the forward operating base, the sun had bled fully into night. The base buzzed with energy as the helicopter touched down and medics swarmed the civilians. Soldiers rushed forward to unload the wounded. And above it all, the hog came in last, wheels screeching as Alexandra brought her battered beast down on the airstrip. She climbed out slowly, her legs stiff, her uniform drenched in sweat. The A-10 looked like it had flown through hell, bullet holes stitched across its fuselage, scorch marks painting its skin. Yet it had endured, as stubborn and unyielding as its pilot. Harlan approached her on the tarmac, helmet tucked under his arm, dirt streaked across his face. For a moment they just looked at each other. No words, just the shared knowledge of men and women who had walked through fire and come out breathing. Finally he broke the silence. "You were right," he said simply. "It can be done." She smirked, weary but proud. "Told you." There was no ceremony, no applause. Just the hum of generators, the cries of civilians, the clatter of stretchers. But in the quiet glances, in the nods exchanged between soldiers, Alexandra Pierce had earned something far greater than applause. She had earned trust. And somewhere deep in the base, far from the battlefield, intelligence officers were already piecing together a bigger picture. The Valley fight was only the beginning. The enemy hadn't just been guarding hostages, they had been testing something, preparing for something larger. A new mission was already taking shape. Alexandra didn't know it yet. Neither did Harlan. But the fight that had bound them together was about to drag them into a war far bigger than either of them imagined. For now, though, she stood on the cracked runway beside her war-torn hog, hand resting on its battered skin. The night was quiet for the moment, and she allowed herself one long breath of relief. Tomorrow the storm would come again. The night after the rescue, the base hummed with an uneasy quiet. The rescued civilians were safe, the SEALs were exhausted but alive, and Alexandra's A-10 sat wounded on the flight line under floodlights, patched with makeshift repairs. But victory felt incomplete, fragile, like a thin sheet of glass hiding cracks beneath. Alexandra didn't sleep. She paced the hangar instead, her hand trailing along the battered fuselage of her hog. The mechanics had done what they could, sealing holes, swapping panels and feeding fuel back into its veins. But the scars remained, etched into metal and memory. She felt them in her bones, reminders of how close the day had come to disaster. The door clanged behind her. Harlan stepped in, dressed in a fresh uniform, though fatigue clung to his face like dust. He carried a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Intel just came in," he said, voice low. "Thought you'd want to hear it." Alexandra raised a brow. "I thought my job was to fly, not shuffle through paperwork." He didn't smile. That told her everything. He laid the folder on a workbench and flipped it open. Photographs spilled out, satellite images, drone stills, intercepted comms logs. All centered on one place, a massive walled compound tucked deep in the mountains. "What is this?" she asked, scanning the pictures. "Where those hostages came from," Harlan replied. "We hit the forward camp, but this," he tapped the image of the compound, "this is the real prize. The enemy's main hub. Arms caches, training facilities, intel servers, you name it. And the hostages were leverage. They weren't just prisoners, they were bargaining chips to buy time while they fortified this." Alexandra whistled softly. "Looks like a fortress." "It is," Harlan said. "And command wants it gone. Not chipped, not scratched, erased. They're calling it Operation Iron Veil. SEALs will hit the compound, but we'll need air cover that can keep pressure on the ground the whole time. That means you." For a long moment, Alexandra stared at the photographs. She could almost feel the weight of the mountains pressing against her chest. Her hog was tough, but even steel had limits. She wasn't afraid of dying, not really, but she hated the thought of failing. Failing her crew, failing the SEALs, failing the civilians who still clung to the hope that people like her could keep them safe. Finally she nodded. "When do we leave?" "Dawn," Harlan said. The mission began under a sky of pale gold. The A-10's engines roared back to life, smoke coughing from their throats as Alexandra guided the beast down the runway. Every panel rattled, every vibration hummed through her bones, but it was alive. She trusted it. Below, the SEALs prepared for insertion. Harlan led them, armored and grim, their helicopter banking low over the hills. It was a strange comfort, Alexandra thought, to know that when she looked down from the sky, he would be there on the ground, steady as stone. The mountains rose like jagged teeth ahead. The compound came into view, high walls, towers bristling with machine guns, convoys of trucks spilling into courtyards. It was a city of war. Alexandra keyed the comms. Visual on target. Beginning run. Her first pass was thunder. The Ju-8 cannon barked its brutal song, shells chewing through trucks and scattering fighters like leaves in a gale. Explosions ripped across the courtyard. The hog screamed past, banking hard, engines howling against the thin mountain air. "SEALs move," Harlan ordered as his team fast-roped into the chaos. Gunfire erupted immediately, short bursts, disciplined, methodical. The compound's defenders swarmed like hornets, but every time they massed, Alexandra's hog carved them apart. She danced across the sky, relentless, the battlefield shifting to her rhythm. But the enemy wasn't unprepared. On her third pass, tracers lanced upward, streaks of red fire cutting the sky. A shoulder-fired missile whooshed from the hillside. Alexandra yanked the stick, flares bursting behind her. The missile curved, confused, then exploded harmlessly in the air. Her cockpit shook with turbulence, alarm screaming. She gritted her teeth. "Not today," she growled, rolling into another dive. On the ground, Harlan's team breached the inner compound. They fought room by room, clearing barracks, seizing intel hard drives, planting charges. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic sting of blood. Yet through it all, they moved with precision, because they knew Alexandra was overhead. But then came the voice on comms that froze her heart. "Pierce, we've got a problem. Enemy convoy inbound from the east. Technicals, mortars, at least a platoon." She checked her ammo counter. Half her 30mm shells were gone. Only a handful of rockets remained. It wasn't enough. "Divert and delay them," Harlan ordered. His voice was calm, but Alexandra heard the edge beneath. If that convoy reached the compound, his team would be trapped. She angled east, scanning the canyon road. Dust clouds rose like ghosts, vehicles fast and heavy. Too many. She lined up, pulled the trigger and let the hog sing. Trucks exploded, burning wreckage clogging the road, but others pushed through, tires grinding over fire. Her ammo counter ticked lower. Her rockets were gone. Still they came. "Pierce, we need more time," Harlan shouted. Alexandra's hand hovered over the throttle. She had one option left. One she had prayed not to use. Her hog carried a belly full of fuel, just enough to make it back to base, if she used it right. She thought of the little girl staring up at her plane with those wide, trusting eyes. She thought of the SEALs who had bled and fought beside her. And she made her choice. "I'm going to block the road," she said. "Pierce, wait," Harlan's voice snapped, but she was already diving. The A-10 screamed into the canyon, so low the rocks seemed to claw at its wings. She fired her last shells into the cliffside. Stones shattered, tumbling down in a roar of avalanche. Dust swallowed the convoy, burying trucks beneath tons of rubble. The survivors scattered, trapped and broken. But the blast caught her too. Shrapnel tore across her fuselage, alarms shrieked, one engine coughing smoke. She fought the controls, pulling the hog up with every ounce of strength. The plane bucked, groaned, but clawed its way back into the sky. "Roads blocked," she rasped over comms. "They're not getting through." On the ground, Harlan's team finished their sweep, charges detonating in a chain of thunder. The compound collapsed behind them as they exfiltrated, their helicopter lifting into the smoke-filled dawn. Above them, Alexandra's hog limped, trailing fire, wings trembling. She could hear the engine dying, could feel the airframe giving way. "Harlan," she said quietly. "I'm here," he answered. "If I don't make it back," she began, but he cut her off. "You will. Just hold on." She smiled faintly, unseen. Always the stubborn one. The runway came into sight, shimmering in the morning heat. Her hog rattled, wheels grinding as they hit asphalt. Sparks screamed from the undercarriage. The plane skidded, veered, then shuddered to a halt in a cloud of smoke. For a heartbeat the world was still. Then the canopy popped and Alexandra climbed out, coughing, battered but alive. The base erupted in cheers, not wild but fierce, the sound of warriors who knew what it meant to come back against the odds. Harlan was there when she staggered down, catching her before her legs gave out. "You're insane," he said, but his grip was steady, his eyes fierce with pride. "Maybe," she admitted. But it worked. Together they looked back at the hog, scarred, smoking, a beast that had given everything and survived. The war wasn't over. The enemy wasn't gone. But they had struck a blow that would echo far beyond the mountains. For now it was enough. And as the sun rose over the battered airfield, Alexandra Pierce knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The end.